For centuries, Europe was just one part of the world. Then something changed, and suddenly European powers were ruling lands thousands of miles away. But why Europe? Why not China, India, or the Middle East?
It was a chain reaction: trade, institutions, military power, and eventually, the Industrial Revolution.
So how did this chain reaction begin? And how did a fragmented corner of the world become the center of global power? Let's go deep into the story and find out.
Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're acting as historical detectives to solve what is literally one of the greatest global whodunits of all time. We're going to figure out exactly how one specific, historically backward region managed to secure unprecedented global power and completely change the course of human history forever. Okay, let's dive right into this mystery by looking at a staggering number: 80%. Just hold that number in your head for a second. That number represents the sheer scale of European domination. Between 1492 and 1914, European powers expanded their reach to conquer, colonize, or control over 80% of the entire globe. Seriously, by the start of World War I, pretty much only China, Japan, and the Ottoman Empire had managed to completely dodge their grasp.
But here's the real puzzle, right? 1,000 years ago, Europe was poor and weak compared to the Middle East and China. It was politically fragmented, hopelessly backward, and honestly, its major long-distance commerce was a slave trade run by Vikings. So how on earth did this totally unexpected outcome actually happen?
To solve this, we first need to define the exact phenomenon that historians are constantly arguing about: the Great Divergence Mystery. Now, this European miracle, or the Great Divergence as scholars call it, wasn't some steady, inevitable climb from the dawn of time. Not at all. It was a massive, sudden socio-economic shift where Western Europe broke through ancient growth constraints and absolutely eclipsed previously dominant empires like Qing China, Mughal India, and the Ottomans.
Let's look at the hard data, because it totally shatters our modern assumptions. According to economic historian Paul Bairoch, back in 1750, the East was actually wealthier on average than the West. Eastern GDP per capita was at $188, compared to the West's $182. So Europe was literally behind right before they suddenly pulled ahead. What caused this explosion of power?
That brings us to our very first suspect in this historical detective story: resources and geography, often called the Pomerantz angle.
The crucial point here is that geography basically handed Europe two massive cheat codes: coal and the Americas. Historian Kenneth Pomerantz points out that European coal mines were incredibly wet, which practically forced them to invent the steam engine just to pump out all that groundwater. That gave Britain a massive head start in early coal energy over wood. Plus, the vast fertile lands of the New World served as this giant agricultural backyard. Pumping in colonial imports like wood, cotton, and sugar literally saved England from needing 23 to 25 million acres of cultivated land. This crazy abundance of coal and colonial exploitation freed up immense resources for Europe to industrialize.
But resources alone aren't enough. Let's move to our second suspect and examine the laws, rules, and institutions that govern these nations.
Economists Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson argue that it all boils down to the rules of the game. Nations flourish under inclusive structures, but they fail under extractive ones. Inclusive institutions decentralize power, secure property rights, and reward innovation. Extractive institutions, on the other hand, just concentrate power in the hands of elites who siphon off the wealth. This elegantly explains why Europe rewarded entrepreneurs, while highly centralized Eurasian empires ended up stifling progress because they were terrified of creative destruction.
And that competitive, innovative spirit birthed a very specific kind of organization. While religion was frequently used as a convenient excuse to take land, the invention of the modern profit-hungry corporation is what truly drove the expansion. I think it's perfectly captured by the Dutch maritime attitude at the time. Basically, their whole vibe was, who cares about Jesus? We want profit.
These newly formed corporations, like the Dutch East India Company, didn't give a passing thought to ideology. They were ruthless machines designed by investors to maximize wealth and project power across oceans. Operating on pure force and greed, they dominated maritime trade, funneling an unbelievable amount of prosperity back home to fund Europe's scientific and political revolutions.
Okay, now we arrive at suspect number 3, the military myth versus reality. Let's do some myth busting. First, let's figure out why European weapons became so deadly so fast. Scholar Philip Hoffman calls it a tournament model. European rulers were locked in an endless, bloody, winner-take-all tournament. Kings were chasing personal glory, and since their subjects were footing the bill through taxes, the kings had literally zero incentive for peace. Through constant, brutal learning by doing, European gunpowder and artillery rapidly outpaced the rest of the world.
But hold on a second. Here is the twist in our mystery. If this military revolution created these massive, well-drilled, technologically advanced standing armies at home in Europe, why were those massive armies almost entirely absent from their overseas conquests?
Which leads us straight to suspect number 4, the missing link, allies and deference.
Political scientist J.C. Sharman completely flips the script on this whole military superiority myth. He reveals that early European expansion wasn't carried out by massive state armies at all, but by tiny, scrappy groups of adventurers. Out in the East, the technological gap in firearms practically didn't exist, so how did they survive? Well, they relied heavily on local indigenous allies. And most surprisingly, Europeans showed absolute deference and subservience to powerful Asian empires. They survived by literally bowing down to Asian great powers until they grew strong enough to take over.
So it absolutely wasn't some unstoppable military steamroller just plowing through the East. Asian and African rulers were easily acquiring Western weapons through trade or defectors anyway. Instead, European survival relied heavily on adapting to local tactics and quietly inserting themselves into existing foreign power networks. It was a slow, calculated insinuation, definitely not an overwhelming conquest.
Let's bring all our suspects together to wrap up this grand historical whodunit. A global perfect storm.
Let's piece our timeline together. We start in the Middle Ages with European poverty, which bred intense, ruthless local competition. The Age of Discovery then brings us the rise of the profit-hungry maritime corporation and the absolute windfall of New World colonies. Finally, the Industrial Revolution hits, heavily accelerated by the sheer geographical luck of wet British coal mines. So you can see how this builds, right? Europe's rise wasn't just one single factor, and it certainly wasn't preordained. It was a perfect storm of coal, corporate greed, constant warfare, and highly strategic deference abroad.
Which brings us right to the present day. If Europe's rise to global dominance was just a historical perfect storm of resources, institutions, and calculated geopolitical maneuvering, I'm going to leave you with this provocative thought. As the geopolitical winds shift today, which region is quietly gathering the ingredients for the next great divergence? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the history you think you know.
Beyond the headlines, this is real truth.